IVM.
Hi, everybody. Just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
कृपया ध्यान दीजिए, the language used on the podcast may not be fit for consumption. We warn you, tread carefully. But listen yaar, don't be so conservative. It's called Cyrus Says. Thanks to the Maharashtra government for giving us a band. The thing we needed most in life after 2 years of shutdown is one more day of shutdown. It's a great, excellent idea. First time in the history of democracy that a sitting government has supported a band or come up with a band. Generally, it's the opposition. Well, that's what democracy was about. But the opposition is upset with the government. For some reason, things have changed in the world. It's politics to another level, which even I can't understand, having studied it for 40 years. Very interesting thing is coming up.
Have you ever wondered where the business world is headed? How the ways in which we create, market, and sell to consumers will evolve? Or if we'll ever go back to wearing pants while working? For answers to all of this and more, tune into Advertising is Dead with me, Varun Tugirala. Every Tuesday, as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond. You can catch all episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcast from.
But first, let me say that the speaker who we're going to talk to here is a person doing a lot of great things, trying to change the world, one COVID vaccine at a time, and more than that. Her name is Angela. Let me get this right. Angela Taneja, Head Advocacy, Oxfam India. Angela, can we see you? Hi. Is it?
Hi.
Let me get the name right. It's not Anjali. It's not Angela. It's not Angela. It's Angela.
Well, for strange reasons, it is Angela.
It is Angela.
It's just the usual name, but with a weird spelling.
Oh, it's a usual Angela with a weird spelling. Okay, fair enough. Good cocktail conversation. If you did something lighter in your life, that would be a great opening. It's 15 minutes we would have spent every time we meet a stranger. I'm a fine one to talk. The people keep calling me Cirrus and all kinds of things. So, Angela, forgive me. You're the head of advocacy Oxfam India. Just before we start chatting, can you explain what that means exactly?
Supporting some of the work related to advocacy within Oxfam India, which is what it literally says, but also directly work on some issues which are related to education, health, as well as in issues of income inequality. I've also worked on education with a wide number of networks. Everyone comes to this fight from somewhere. I happen to come from the education.
Okay, before we get into, because I've done a little bit of research here, and I feel a little worried because I might be in the slightly less underprivileged group. So let's say, call it the more privileged group. So I'm wondering whether there's a sense of hypocrisy because we're talking about underprivileged world, not just India. India, of course, very much part of that world. And we're going to discuss this in detail. But I'm just a little worried now because I start feeling guilty when I read about all this, and all your ideas and thoughts, or the Oxfam's ideas and thoughts seem to be anti-rich in a sense. So just quickly, I want to explain, is there a way where we can't target the rich and yet help the poor? Is there a middle path, so to speak?
Question is, which rich? I am sure none of us, even you, are not part of the super rich. You're not a billionaire.
No, not the corporate rich. But you're going to increase tax across the board, then we will be affected as well. I will get a little scared because I think we, the middle class, actually are the ones they think are rich, make us pay all the taxes, increase all that, and then we'll suffer even more and become poor. So you'll have more poor. Think of that.
So the focus is not to increase the taxes on the middle class or including the upper middle class. It's about the taxation on the super rich, which is, unless you are a billionaire, you have nothing to lose, you have something to gain.
Oh, thank you so much, Angela. You're an angel. I'll change your name. I'll take out the A. It's just Angel. Angel, as we say in North India. Amazing. Thank God. That's wonderful. Yeah, attack those billionaires. Those people should be brought to their knees. They have enough money. What the hell? Okay, let's now start right at the beginning. This whole conversation, I think, will be dedicated largely to wealth, vaccines, more the sense that vaccines reach the rich faster. Whether we like it or not, that seems to be the pattern. Or reach the rich first. There seems to be a priority. So let's start with this big question. Why is there discrepancy in COVID-19 vaccine availability for the poor, especially here?
Two sets of reasons. One is there is a shortage overall, and therefore, when there is a shortage, it's those who are more privileged with greater access, with greater ability to pay, are the ones who are more likely to get it. But fundamentally, it is also because the way the system has been structured, for especially within India, has also been more in favor of those who are more privileged, be it in terms of, if you look at availability of vaccine in states, only 10% of the population in Bihar has yet received the full vaccination, or 9% in UP, versus reasonable rates in some of the southern states. Therefore, more richer states, more educated states have had a better run. Urban areas have had a better run relative to rural areas, and people from marginalized communities like Dalits and Muslims have again had a worse time compared to those who are from a more privileged background. And of course, women, more than 40 million women, less women have received the COVID shot compared to men.
Why?
Why? Because the system relies on, it has historically relied on the use of digital technology for registration of the vaccine, which women have less access to, because when it comes to COVID and all the other stuff, women are not the one with the.
Are you saying government has done a disservice in a sense? I mean, how else do you reach? How do you connect the whole country if you don't digitalize? What else could they have done? How else could they have to make sure that there are no margins left out?
What it is currently, the same thing that it's currently doing, it's relying on walk-in registrations. So yes, it's essential to have an online repository of information, but it doesn't mean that registration has to be online only. And the second part of it is the fact that larger states with larger populations and more poorer states have not received as many vaccines as the rest. Lastly, 25% of all vaccines have been set aside for sale in private hospitals. They are expensive. When looking at the statistics, if one is looking at an average Indian family of 3 adults, it's 3.5K almost to buy the full course of Covishield, 7.2K for Covaxin, which is pretty much average family income of 24% of the monthly income for Covishield, or 48% of the average Indian family income for Covaxin. So that means poorer can't benefit, which also means some section has been set aside for which isn't being, in fact, when you look at the data, isn't actually even being picked up. So therefore, effectively, it legitimizes the rich jumping the COVID queue.
I just don't understand one thing, just if you can explain to me, which is, if it's a proper pandemic as it is, global pandemic, etc., affecting everybody, civil life comes to a standstill, you can't leave your house. Shouldn't it be on the government of the states and in our case, center and states? Is it the onus on them to sort of either subsidize it almost to nothing or give it literally free? Wouldn't that be the way out, first and foremost, before we get into the whole process? Because life came to a standstill. So I would think that now the government has to really stand up. It's like being under severe pressure, in a situation, and now they have to show their leadership skills in that. And I would think that somehow they have to figure out a way to budget their, whatever they spend, the expenditure, in such a way that they're able to come up with reduce defense, don't build statues. Some of the road work is rubbish. The metros are never complete. You can give them 5 years more to do that, and just divert the funds to, if it's a state thing or local thing, it can be done, I'm sure, in a way, so that the places you mentioned, Bihar, UP, and then you talk about different groups and all that. So I'm just thinking they should have really given it free. Although in Bihar's case, I know the problem is that prohibition has caused a lot of trouble. That's why nobody wants to leave the house. You're not allowed to drink. So, that's very painful. But we'll leave that aside for now, Angela. So why isn't it free? or close to free.
Well, it is free for 75%. Beats me why it isn't free for all.
And the whole idea, the moment you have this slightly pricey option in the private hospitals, it starts becoming a business, and the humane factor goes out of the window, right? And then you start. There's no end to that. So from Majburi, we've gone to capitalism at its worst.
Yeah, states have been asking for precisely what you are saying. Allow us, for example, Rajasthan has asked for precisely what you are saying. Give us the entire allocation. Let us decide. Some places there aren't plain and simple that many private hospitals. There aren't 25% private hospitals. There aren't 25% people who can afford it. Let us decide. For example, Orissa saying we only have 5% private hospitals. Why do we need 5% hospitals? Why do they need to be given 25% vaccines?
In all this, what do you call it, a bureaucratic mess? We were unprepared. It's easier to talk like this after, in hindsight, for us to have this conversation or point fingers, etc. So, or are there countries in the world who've done it really well in an organized sort of way where every part of the society has benefited and no one has been left out, and it's almost holistic the way the pandemic has been dealt with?
So some countries have obviously done it better than others. Some have been more prepared from day one. Somehow, in our case, there was a complacency of we have defeated the pandemic, there won't be a second wave.
Yes.
Which unfortunately proved to be not true. And in some ways, we're seeing the same sense of complacency. Hey, we're not going to get a third wave either.
Yeah.
So therefore,
but mind you, it's not scientists but politicians who are saying that. So having said that, I mean, it's oranges talking about apples in a sense. Because I don't think the scientific community jumped up and said we are saved from the first wave or even now from the second wave. It's mostly just politicians and leaders trying to get some popular statements across and make people feel happy and whatever, confident. I don't know, rightly or wrongly. So sorry to cut you there, but I just want to quickly tie in the World Hunger bit, which is what Oxfam is famous, well, not famous for, but famous for trying to create awareness about it and find solutions. So what is the connect now? Because obviously this pandemic has caused more world hunger, I suppose. And the disparity in income is probably worse now than it was 2 years ago, with people losing jobs, the GDP going down initially. Working from home doesn't work for everyone. Many sectors, daily wage earners, etc., really suffered. So how do we stand vis-a-vis world hunger now? And has COVID really been a real pain in the what?
Sure, there are obviously disparities in wealth. 1% of the richest in the world now have more wealth than 6.9 billion people. And let's just say most of these are men. And men own
I hate men.
Well, we can't live without them either.
But the only biological function to have children, other than that, there's no reason for them. Come on. We can keep 20 per country. We can keep in a box somewhere. Yeah. That's not important.
But anyway, the 22 richest men have more wealth than all the women in the world.
Not one woman in the top billionaires.
That's the word. That's the way. Most of them happen to be rich.
Have you counted Indian politicians? Indian female politicians? There might be one. Just be careful. Undisclosed wealth is different from wealth. Yeah. Sorry. So
one has actually looked for that figure. There doesn't seem to be, unfortunately, a valid source for
That's
that one.
We're joking about it, but it's a horrible statistic. Talking about equality and all that. I mean, I have a young daughter, and I'm just thinking that's just terrible. That even today in 2021, if you look at the top billionaires in the world, I'm sure we did a quick Google. Silvery will do it offline for us. And there are no women, not one, or probably just like less than 3 or 5%. So
on top of that, majority are likely to be white. It's not like it's
Oxfam reviving sexism, racism, everything else while solving for world hunger. Fair enough. Yeah. So
when it comes to the flip side of this is the fact that during the pandemic, because supply chains have been disrupted, because all the shops have been closed, because transportation of food was not possible in many instances, because unemployment increased, there has been an increase in the global food prices. There has been a growth in hunger. If you lost your job, you have been forced to walk a few hundred kilometers to get home. Odds are you're not particularly well-resourced to feed your family at that point in time. Things are not helped by the climate crisis which comes on top of, as if things have not been bad enough to begin with.
Yeah, just taking from your point, I think for us that beginning lockdown, April May ki baat hai, I think basically, where suddenly the urban India shut their doors and gates, middle class and upper middle class India shut their doors and gates, and threw out all the immigrants who work for them, or largely immigrants, and literally threw them out. And you realize that while you can survive 6 months, 1 year without earning, because you have a certain amount of money in the bank, or you have resources, or you can still work online, like you and I earned lots of money during that period while others were starving. A lot of people didn't. They actually couldn't find a place to go to. This is something that's just been washed under the carpet. How many immigrants are trying to find their way back to, let's say, Jharkhand from Mumbai? Impossible. There were no trains. There were no ways to go. You couldn't leave you didn't know how to exit or enter. You wouldn't be taken in any case, even if you got out. So I think they realized how helpless they are. The word majburi in India, I think, has never been more clear than those people, those of us who realize we just don't have the wealth to survive this kind of crisis. So I think Oxfam's role now is far more prominent for me than it was ever before. This may sound vulgar to say, but I really think it's really opened that up for everybody to understand that the inequality and the disparity of income in India is ugly, it's cruel, it's embarrassing. That's why I don't know how this helps, Angela, but I personally wear dirty clothes all the time and try to look as lower middle class as possible. And I've done a very good job of that. Nobody calls me sir anymore. So I'm just trying to create a more egalitarian society in my own way. Now, having bored you with my little lecture, I'll move on. Climate change, COVID-19, all happening at the same time. But now we talk about the corporates that you mentioned in the beginning, the billionaires, the big corporations. I think you guys are very clear that they are almost like the villain of the piece. So you want to just tell us how that happened and how the disparity broadened, and what are we supposed to do now to play catch up or to control, or for the corporates to come to the party and help?
So, how did things happen? Because the system largely, whether billionaires themselves can be considered villains of the peace or not, ultimately responsibility in any country rests with the state. So, therefore, if the system is created which allows a few people to benefit disproportionately higher than the rest, fundamentally it's because the nation states allowed this to happen. So therefore, why are things the way they are? Because somehow the economic system, not just in India but globally, prioritizes wealth over, say, labor. Therefore, when it comes down to it, the system is rigged in favor of those who have money to begin with. We're in the middle of the Pandora Papers. We have seen how the super rich are able to
Reinvent their taxes.
get away with this, with hiding their wealth and not having to pay taxes. Those opportunities are not available to those who are hardworking, middle class, or the poor. This system is based on undertaxing of corporations and rich individuals, and the government is allowing it to happen, and is choosing to allow this to happen instead of investing in vital public services like, say, healthcare and education, which could have benefited the majority, including the middle class.
What do you think then about cryptocurrencies? I think cryptocurrency is basically trying to decentralize power and take away the idea of one central factor telling you what to do or controlling things. So in a sense, that is like a way to go away from this whole system we've had for hundreds of years, where we had one entrepreneur who then becomes a leader or forms a board or whatever, which decides what is profitable for themselves, which is a minority in a sense. So I think cryptocurrency may not be such a bad thing then. Just coming back to your major point about control and monopoly and wealth distribution.
I'll take a pass on that one because
you don't want to endorse it.
Yes, yes. There are conceptually there are reasons why it would do so, but I don't think the system is stable enough to provide a true real alternative as of now.
Or maybe it's too good to be true. We don't know. Time will tell. Let's just shift a little bit then to the government. See, Oxfam also does a lot of has to do roles, rather join hands with the governments, not just Indian, but various governments of the world. So what do you do then? How, because there's no point just pointing fingers. I suppose you're looking for solutions end of the day. You can't just go on strike all the time and, point fingers. So what are the things that Oxfam does with governments, and what can governments do for Oxfam? And let's say hello to the gentleman. Hello, uncle. Is that the husband?
He's left. No, my father.
Your dad? All right. I'm sorry. I couldn't see properly. I just saw a male here.
It's okay.
Please say hello to him from all
He
of us.
he ducked out very quickly.
He realizes something serious, so he just saw my face and ran. A man of class and taste, no doubt about that. So what do you guys, coming back to the point about government, they have to be allies as well, right? I mean, how do you, if you're going to win this war, so to speak, if you're going to, at least make a dent, you have to have the governments on your side, right? In a way, or find some common ground.
Yes, whether this is, there are progress in any international, a lot of these solutions ultimately have to come through an agreement that's more global than just national. For example, we're at the final stages of of a new tax framework for, so therefore, yes, one ends up finding common ground often on international fora, where countries from the global south may have similar concerns to what is voiced by, because fundamentally one is talking about things that make sense to majority of people. So one always does find allies. Similarly, within India, there may be some states that are more likely to support some of these things, again because they not because we are saying it, but because fundamentally it's making sense and it's based on evidence, and one sees reason in doing things that are reasonable, for the lack of better words.
Okay, so there are progressive states whose names you won't mention, and there are less progressive states in our country as we speak.
Not for everything, but there may be states that are more likely to act on some specific agendas than others.
Giving examples, please tell us. Yeah.
So, for example, there may be, say, with respect to, since we were talking about vaccination earlier, the question of, say, the getting rid of that 25 reservation for the rich through vaccination in private hospitals. Fundamentally, Orissa, Jharkhand, Rajasthan, Kerala, Orissa, Tamil Nadu, some other states have already asked for this. So therefore, obviously, it's not an illogical thing, given a large number of states are fundamentally having the same concerns.
Right. So no, but I'm just trying to understand. So what you're saying is we've got some progress happening. I'm just looking at light at the end of the tunnel, some positive note. So there are some states in some issues, and since we're talking basically COVID and world hunger, linking them together, in some issues there are some states in India where you've got a better sort of deal going, and you're getting some sort of feedback from them, which is positive, right? Fair to say?
Yeah.
Fair. Okay. Then let's get to this one term before we go into break, which I need to understand properly. What do we mean by vaccine nationalism?
Some countries preferring to immunize, vaccinate their own people at the expense of ensuring vaccination for all, irrespective of location. For example, when you look at it, a large number of countries in the global north have almost vaccinated, 70 to 80% double vaccinated, 70 to 80% of its population, and are now entering the phase of let's have the second dose of the vaccine as well. So therefore, prioritizing your own versus working for the benefit of all.
I'm going to ask a dangerous question. Is that wrong? What do you do as a government? You're accountable to your people. The humanitarian angle, unfortunately, is like Sophie's choice. But what do? Do you save a country in South America or Africa, put them above your own people? How do you explain that? I mean, it's morally, it's not an easy answer, I understand. But what do? You are accountable to the people you represent.
So, two levels to this. One is, no one is in a pandemic. No one is safe until everyone is safe, because we've all seen the Delta variant spread through the world. Therefore, happened to have started from India. So therefore, no matter how well you are vaccinated in the global north, as long as different new variants keep coming up from anywhere in the world, they can still come back, and it can still come back and bite you.
Angela, Taneja is saying is that this time we can't blame China. Now we've taken over. Is it? We're spreading it, the third bastion.
So therefore, one way or the other, fundamentally, it's you need to have everyone vaccinated. Until everyone is vaccinated in the world, until then you don't have global herd immunity. Until then you will continue to have breakthrough infections.
But we're living in with logistical nightmares. I mean, my son just went to Canada for studies, and I mean, not accepting this vaccine, not accepting that vaccine, this red tape over the quid pro quo between UK and India, bureaucratic wrangling that goes on unnecessary. It's like petty children fighting in a playground sometimes. What you're talking about is all very good, no doubt about that. But where's the global perspective in actuality when it comes to leadership? Are they actually holding hands and talking to each other and saying, listen, because if they did that, at least the main 150, 160 countries, let's leave out 20, 30 of the countries who unfortunately don't want to play ball. But if they actually did that, we would be sitting on one sort of common vaccine certificate and travel would be much easier. But there's a lot of red tape and there seems to be a lot of fighting. And it seems to do with the economics of who's making what vaccine and who's exporting what vaccine as well.
So the other part of it is the fact that it's not about, there has been a fair amount of consensus, if not over mutual recognition of vaccines, especially in countries that have, in the global north, who have never been particularly welcoming to people from outside at the best of times. But there has been a fair amount of consensus from a large number of countries, especially from the global south. And in fact, India leading in terms of thought leadership and mobilization, in terms of asking for a temporary waiver of intellectual property rights, allowing, ensuring, forcing some of the companies that have been producing the vaccine to share the recipe with other companies and the rest of the world, to ensure that production can start more quickly, so that those shortages that you're talking about in terms of making sure that everyone has an access to the vaccine could be ensured. In fact, 158 countries, when I last checked, were in support of the intellectual property waiver. And it's very rarely that 158 countries agree on something. Unfortunately, some countries, again, say Germany and some of the other richer countries, have been against the intellectual property waiver. Again, unfortunate, but that's how the cookie is crumbling as of now.
Yeah, although a 5-year-old kid once told me that why can't they all just make the vaccines for everybody? If it's a humane thing and humanitarian thing, it should be done on a global footing and pooled together and then resourced together, or rather sourced out together to everyone, depending on priority, depending on wealth management, etc. GDPs of countries or whatever. But there could have been a system in place to sort of do it in a very systematic manner across the world. But obviously, that's just too idealistic and it's never going to happen.
Because 158 countries in the world are asking for it. It's a handful of 4 or 5 to 10 countries who are still blocking that waiver.
But they're blocking it. Why? Because they want to, their profitability margin, etc., goes out of the window. It all boils down to that.
Because largely, yes. So therefore, the negotiations are on. And even countries like the US, which have traditionally been supporters of the free market, etc., have come out in support of the intellectual property waiver in the WTO.
Maybe there's a sense of we are doing more than we need to. It's why UK wanted to leave the euro at the end of the day, union, because by and large, they think we're carrying the smaller countries on our back. So similarly, some of the countries are saying we are, punching more than the others, and what's in it for us? So it all boils down to that at the end of the day. So much for humanitarianism. I'm a cynic. Angela, I have to tell you, y'all are doing great work and may you continue to do so, may your tribe increase. But I'm a cynic. I believe human beings just suck. Why didn't you do more work with dogs like me? It's a more beautiful and spiritual movement. Come and join us, Angela. When you have days off from Oxfam, join Welfare of Stray Dogs. Look after doggies. Much more, I think, spiritually inclined job. But we're going to stop here for a second as we have a break and we bring in young Silvery, our producer, young man who's a venture capitalist and a man who gives nothing to the poor and increases the disparity in the world every single day. Silvery, let's have a look at you as we take a break. Here he is.
Hi. Good morning, Cyrus. Hi, ma'am. Hi,
Good
Angela,
morning.
ma'am. How are you doing?
Hi.
I don't know whether you want to call her ma'am. Angela, you want to be called ma'am?
Not really.
Okay. Hi,
I
Angela.
don't think so.
Hello.
They never works here. Yeah, maybe that's too formal. I mean, too
Okay.
informal. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, young man, what do you have to say as the future of the country?
What I have to say? I mean, with people like Angela, ma'am, fighting for us, I think we'll make it.
Fighting, not fighting for you, you rich guy. She's fighting for
I
people
know,
who don't have food on their plate.
Yes,
Who haven't got the
correct.
vaccines. You got double vaccines out of turn using influence. You're exactly the reason why she's there. I mean, that also happens so much. I mean, how is such a corrupt world? I don't know how you can do this job, really. I've had so many rich friends who got the double vaccine well out of turn because they have doctors in the family and this and that. Well, older relatives of people on the lower in the economic strata had to wait for months. I mean, it's just so unfair after some time how people just worried about themselves from a selfish point of view. A young 20-year-old is given double vaccine well before an 80-year-old who's in really bad condition and really needs it first. Anything could happen to her if she was to leave the house. It's so difficult to understand so many things in the tech world, like artificial intelligence. What is that? It just sounds like science fiction, doesn't it? That's great. Luckily, though, Intel's digital readiness program empowers everyone with skill sets, mindsets, and tool sets to use in an AI-fueled world so you don't end up like me. As part of the Intel for Youth program, Intel's been working with the CBSE, Ministry of Education, and the Government of India to empower today's youth to build social impact solutions while demystifying what AI is. Now, how do you take advantage of this is Angela's question, and it's a good question. Purchase an Intel Core-powered PC and you get free access to 80-plus hours of immersive and hands-on training about AI. On completion of the program, you will get a certificate that will give you access to AI tool sets to try to put what you learn to good use. So practical training as well as theory. Don't wait. Log on to futurebanawonderful.intel.com. Future Bana Wonderful by bringing home an Intel-powered PC today. Follow me at Instagram and Twitter on Bored Brocha. I'm so bored, I need your help. I need your love. I need your touch. Okay, just follow me. What do we have in the AMAs?
Yeah, we have quite a lot of AMAs for ma'am. The first one comes in from Janil Bain. Mr. Emmons has a follow-up. So Janil Bain says, is running a budget deficit justified in India? Is the excess money spent in any way helping the poorest marginalized on the ground?
So what the World Bank as well as the IMF have said is don't worry too much about the deficit right now. Spend your way out of the pandemic by making sure that there is enough of cash in people's hands to create demand, which will then rejuvenate the economy. So therefore, the best of experts are saying, let's not worry about it now. And at a time when it is the real size of the relief package has been less than 1%, around 1% of GDP, as compared to some much higher levels of subsidies and assistance that have been given in the richer countries as not in real, just in real terms, which one understands may not be possible for all countries, but also in proportion to their economic status of the country, etc. So therefore, would it benefit the poor? Sure, because ignoring the real needs of the poor doesn't help. And if one invests in the things that truly matter in terms of be it a public health system that works ahead, that is made to work rather before the third wave hits, or addressing the fact that our kids have been stuck at home without access to schools until very recently for 1.5 years, making sure that the school system starts returning to normal would be, among other things, absolutely essential things without which you can't hope to a return to normalcy for everyone. And yes, it would happen to benefit the poor the most as well.
So what you're saying, Angela, is I have to take one for the team. here, because I'll go out and spend all my money, and all the money will go to all the different vendors, and they will earn money, and the country will earn money, and the economy cycle will be revived, but I will be broke. So in a sense, we understand, you do the right
Yeah.
thing, put the money on the table, the rest of the world, the rest of the country, the rest of society will benefit, but you may fall down through the net there. I'm just telling you, this is my feedback. Is that fair to say, Angela, or are you dismissing it?
If one is talking about the country, it's not that you will go broke. There, ultimately, you are the one who's printing the money. So therefore, you will get money from elsewhere.
So speaking as a government servant, okay, fair enough. Let's go to the next
Sure.
one.
Next one comes from Prithvi. He says, question for Tanisha ma'am. Everything requires regulation, but is there an overreach by government where you feel there needs to be less intrusive regulations?
That really varies from sector to sector. There are that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is yes, there is regulation. In some cases, I'm not sure if it is excessive regulation or the fact that the modality through which regulation is done isn't necessarily the best way. There needs to be a rational way of doing it. There needs to be a more open way of doing it. There needs to be greater transparency and accountability in how this is done, which often is lacking. We've seen, say, income tax rates being potentially misused, let's just put it this way, by the state.
I think by now we've criticized government enough. There's no need to hold your punches.
So therefore, just because the government of India may be misusing provisions related to, say, financial audits, doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be stronger financial auditing. That doesn't mean that there is no tax avoidance, and one shouldn't throw away the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah, but also there's the problem of the regulation not being followed also sometimes. So like something is there in law, but it's not actually exercised. To give a silly example, which irritates me, is how one-ways are not maintained, no entries. People bring their cars in from both sides. So sometimes they're there in print or they're there, out there, but nobody's following it exactly. And that in India, that always happens. As you said, it's different.
And then that becomes a basic ground for rent seeking, because the provision is on the books, and then it lends itself to abuse by the state. If you have regulations, enforce them, implement them fairly and equitably, and it's only then that regulations truly work.
Okay. When this young man becomes a corporate, I think things will change, at least in Powai. Silvery, next one.
All right. This is again one more from Prithvi. He says, speaking of vaccine nationalism, our government did the opposite. They gave priority to exporting first and then reeling under the second wave as a cost. Of course, there was a contractual obligation to this, but what are your thoughts on this?
Is that fair?
That's the tricky part here. Fundamentally, we should have made our own pre-bookings well in time.
You said help everyone in a sense.
And therefore, it's understandable that one prioritized the making sure vaccines became available to the place where we had the world's biggest COVID hotspot at the time. So therefore, responding to the true need is an understandable reaction, but it doesn't mean that one should not have made pre-orders, and so that contractual obligations were truly respected.
But then, Angela, we just discussed the whole thing about it's a global problem and a humane problem, and in which case it's a priority that depends upon need. And if you thought that India was not as badly off as X country, then from a global perspective, the right thing to do is export, right?
Which is why we have resumed. But at a time when we were in the middle of the second wave, us choosing to, in some ways, disregard our obligations internationally, in some ways.
So it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. Not only the government side, but this was a tough one. Initially, they may have called it wrong.
Yes, it's a tough one. Fundamentally, when everyone else was making pre-orders, we should have done the same instead of hoping कि अपने आप ठीक हो जाएगा. things don't
Or
improve
maybe
on their own, unfortunately.
maybe it's a bit of the Donald Trump Fauci situation. Maybe we just celebrated too soon the first time. Like I said, politicians are not scientists, and went with perhaps what they call instinct, populist instinct sometimes, and that really is a dangerous thing to do when it comes to things like this, which are based completely on data, experience, situation, research, and then you come up with some sort of answer which is still not fully correct. As we know, we still don't have a proper solution or answer. We're just hoping that these vaccines are working. Okay, I won't add to that, but I just want to give the government one point there. I think they were in a bit of a spot about trying to help others as well at the same time, which fundamentally is not the wrong thing to do. Whether there was a profitable reason to that or not is secondary, and something which is debatable. But Silvery, we'll go to the next.
All right, sure. This one comes in from Janil Bain. He says, "Have the government schemes helped the population a lot, who have newly become unemployed because of the pandemic, or are they left to fend for themselves still?"
Again, mixed bag.
Okay.
Schemes like NREGA have manifestly helped. Those who have been able to get cash in their bank accounts, that has helped. The challenge is not everyone who is eligible and who needs it has been able to receive it. So good effort, but more needs to be done.
But Angela, just looking at specific examples, I was talking to a waiter, a place we used to frequent, and he has been taken out of the job at age 40. He's 46 years old, and he was saying he can't just get a job in the hotel industry at the moment, serving or in the kitchen or whatever, because nobody wants to take that age group, 46, 47 in the first. So there are many cases, if you take them as singular and not as big lobbies, many cases where there doesn't seem to be any solution. What do we do? A, there's not enough jobs out there. A, there's not enough. You said put money into the market. That's all very well. But, the person who's been cut off, he, on a specific personal level, is not able to go with any confidence into the market and get the next job like perhaps he could have 10 years ago.
So the European solution to it was wage subsidies. Instead of forcing companies to choose between employing people or keeping them underemployed, but still keeping them on the rolls and still receiving at least some salary. An alternative was the government comes in and pitches in with a part share of the salary, so that people are not left on the street. So those options have been followed by several countries, but just happens to be not us.
That's okay. I shouldn't laugh, but that's not right. But again, it becomes a state issue. Then again, it can't point your finger at the central government, because then the Maharashtras look after their own, UPS look after their own in a sense, and then as you go down, it becomes more localized. Literally, like a councillor has to look after his area, literally, and you have to try and redress the people who have lost their jobs and look at them as specific cases. Maybe in that area, hotels are big, so that sector has suffered more. In another area, it's just dukandars with normal provision stores. So I don't know. It's very complicated to find answers to all this. But I'm just thinking, after 2 years of pandemic, almost 1.5 years at least complete, have we recovered from the loss of income, which is permanent, not the loss of income which is temporary, where people are still managing, like you said? Those who have lost jobs and the income in the family has come to a standstill. Are we recovering from that?
No, we haven't. It will take a while before everyone does. In some cases, the impact is going to be intergenerational. As I said in the beginning, I happen to come from the education field. So therefore, when it comes to the impact on the pandemic on the education sector, we have 1.5 years of kids not being in school. In majority of cases, at least by all accounts, 70 to 80% of them have not are experiencing learning losses. So therefore, the implication of that is kids have lost a year, and that year of will never be regained, and that will have an impact on their capacity to earn across their entire lifespan. So therefore, it's not just the impact that has been in terms of wages for adults. It's also the future of the next generation that one is talking about. And again, probably more needs to be done, and it probably needs to be done centrally, because economies of scale suggest that it makes more sense for it to happen at the higher, if it has to be done across the entire country, it's probably leadership that one expects from a national government and not just the states, not least given revenues are available with the central government and not the states, because a majority of our taxes go to the central government, which then reallocates them. If they are the ones with the money, then they should also fund what is needed.
Well, don't start this whether Maharashtra and Punjab will secede next. We don't need that. But just quickly to understand, now what about Garba, for example? It sounds innocuous, but why is Garba banned? I mean, if you're going to office and you're allowing 50% at sports grounds and you're allowing clubs to function and restaurants and all that, what's wrong with Garba? I'm a proponent of Garba, and it's an outdoor space, generally speaking, and you're just banging sticks from a distance. You're not really interacting as much as you do in an office climate, like where I am right now. So I was just thinking, some of the schemes, Garba symbolizing it, don't make sense. Cutoffs at 10 p.m. Again, I'm talking from an economic point of view. Because Garba is a whole industry for events and anchors and dancers and singers and musicians and caterers. And also, of course, whether it's a hotel cutting off at 10, where on weekends they really make their money. In Delhi or Mumbai, they make the money from 10 to 2 or 3 in the old days, which is the more money than they make the rest of the week. So if you look at it from purely commercial point of view, I don't know whether these tokenisms of shutting down comedy. Silvery is a comedian. You're allowing only 50% in these small places that they perform in. It makes no sense because they need that full gate money. And honestly, with this 50 or 100 people, it's not going to make a difference. You'll get the COVID, you won't get the COVID. I cannot believe that there's scientific data to show that 50 or 100 people will make a difference in that same space. So I'm just thinking a lot of that seems to be just, they've just come up with these ideas just to buy time. They don't seem to be practical enough. One English pub owner famously said, apparently the UK government thinks 10:01 is when COVID starts, because 10 p.m. he wants us to down our shutters. So 10:01 onwards is when COVID will enter UK. Till then you're safe, which is literally what it comes out to be. So I'm just thinking, do you think that we're perhaps just not coming up with practical ideas to control the situation? The effects, of course, I'm talking about economic effects, not just pleasure and having fun and all that coming to a standstill, which is also important.
Agreed. The same, why would cinema halls be allowed to open, and why would every malls be open, cinema halls be open, alcohol joints be open, everything else is open while primary schools remain closed?
Yeah, exactly.
When evidence suggests that the younger children are more immune, have better capacity to fight the coronavirus, correct, why would the schools not be opened?
So why?
Logic.
So what's the logic there?
It beats me.
So there is no answer. So sometimes the powers that be across the world, I'm not just blaming India here, but across the world, they just come up with stupid tokenisms, it looks like. I just feel that just to stop the paranoia or something, they will put these rules and regulations in place which don't make sense. They're not logistical and practical in a way I can understand the formula and relate to it from a scientific point of view. You're just making up numbers. 50 log theek hai. Wedding hall mein 50 log theek hai. Shouldn't it be more about the size of the wedding hall? That doesn't really come into it. It's just 50. They just put a cap on it and that's it. Which I thought is stupid, because you take the Wankhede Stadium and have a Sangeet, which happens in Mumbai in October, November onwards, 50 people will be lost. There's no question. You can easily have 60. So I don't know. My whole point is commerce based. I just feel that commerce takes a beating because you're overdoing the situation. We have to fight with the vaccines in your body and hope that nothing happens. If it happens, go stay at home for 14 days and hope you don't die or pass it on. I can't understand this thing. We are on the theater business, Silvery and me. I was talking to some producers. Cinema guys also 50%. They need big. The films have to be hits. You need people. You need bums on seats. The match doesn't add up. After 2 years of limping, you can't just give me 50% in an auditorium. We pay about 50-60 grand to book, say, Sophia Baba Hall for a play. We're already in the red because we can only get 50% back if we get a full house, which is difficult because people will not come. Forget the quality of the play, which is why they shouldn't come. That's not the story. Anyway, Angela, I don't know why I'm asking you this, because you're here to solve world hunger, which means you come into play in the interval of the play when we are serving food at lower rates to people. Silvery, 2 more questions and I have to go and earn money from capitalist India.
Okay, sure. This next one comes in from Mr. M again. He says, how quick are governments to respond to your requirements? Do you receive helping hands from governments when there are calamities like floods, pandemics, etc.?
I think she's mentioned that different responses from different governments. Yeah.
Yes. So with respect to the calamities, when it comes down to humanitarian, there have been a fair amount of openness from pretty much all the state as well as national state governments, at least. when it comes to the willingness to receive help, receive support. So goes without saying, when it comes down to more tricky issues of what should be the taxation system, what that's where openness may or may not be there, but that's quite understandable because it's a longer process of winning hearts and minds that's involved.
I think similarly, we talked to the two kids who are doing a lot of work with the United Nations a few days back. It's a similar situation. It's almost like it's not like one government, which is one voice for all governments. It's also different people that they're dealing with. Maybe you and I have to come to power. I feel for commerce, you feel for hunger. Together, we get the balance right. Because one thing leads to another. You can't just do one thing. The balance of the world is about everything coming together in an equitable or somewhat equitable distribution, which is, I don't know how ever going to happen. Chalo, we get one more in.
Sure. I think ma'am already kind of answered this, but Kumar asks, ma'am, do you think the rich should be taxed much higher than middle class, or do you believe in trickle down economics?
I think the trickle down doesn't work. If it had to work, it would have worked by now. So yes, it's essential for the super rich to pay their equal fair share of taxes, whereas the middle class has been paying its share already. It's again, going back to Pandora Papers, it's the super rich who are able to avoid them. It's the super rich who use offshore accounts. It's the super rich who use those offshore accounts to buy aeroplanes while in prison. So therefore, it's about them needing to start doing the responsible thing.
Yeah, but let's just make it very clear. It's very super rich. So Amit Doshi, the head of this IVM podcast, he is super rich. I'm very much middle class. So let's not tax everyone. She's talking about billionaires. Angela, please be clear. You're talking about billionaires are really the cream of society, the big corporations, guys who own lots and lots and lots of wealth across many, sectors, not just one thing. So they have to pay more, which is, I think, a fair sum, because if you look at their earnings, I think you mentioned, Angela, at the top, 1% makes more money than the rest of the world. Less than 1% of entrepreneurs make.
The wealth of India's billionaires increased by 35% during the lockdown.
Wow.
What the billionaires earned during the pandemic was enough to give every Indian 94,000 rupees. And the wealth of just the top 11 billionaires is enough to support Manrega or the NREGS scheme or the entire health ministry of India for the coming 10 years. Just one man.
There you go. Yeah. So I just want to mention, I'm not that man or those 11 men. I'm not any of them and don't know any of them. But yeah, ouch. But this is not just India. This is most of the world where basically, commerce is king. The US, the Western Europe countries, South American countries. It is like that. The disparity is not just Indian.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So the solution is,
one ends up using Ambani since he is the richest man, but it would be Jeff Bezos or whoever in the global north, because
right.
It's irrespective of the country, the system is rigged in favor of this minuscule top 1%.
I just got abused by Elon Musk because you called Jeff Bezos the richest man in the US. He just sent a vulgar picture with his.
Fair enough.
Very upset. Very upset. I mean, they work so hard to reach where they reach. It's like, yeah. Sorry,
Yes.
quick, Silvery. I really got to leave now.
Yeah, one more.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. This last one. Prithvi asks, any views on universal basic income?
Good one. Good idea, as long as it doesn't result in the poor losing access to some things. Because often when UBI is introduced, the idea is you rationalize schemes to give this basic income, whereas as long as the poor don't lose opportunities while also getting the UBI, great idea. Therefore, as with a lot of good ideas, the devil is in the detail.
So, Angela, last question: Are you rich, super rich, very rich, multi-billionaire, middle class, upper middle class? What are you?
I would say middle class.
You pay your taxes.
I do pay my taxes.
Why can't we get a 1-year tax break here from the pandemic? We could just take a little break and let's just let the super rich pay for 1 year. Isn't that a fair deal?
Let's see if they're ready to, or whether the government is willing and able to make them do so.
Willing, I don't know, but able, yes. No, willing, I don't know. Anyway, thank you. This has been wonderful. Thank you for humoring us with my silly comments from time to time. Silvery has learned a lot from you. Today, he will not eat because he knows a lot of people in the world are eating less. So take 1 day off from food, Silvery, to show some sort of solidarity. Don't make fun of these things. Pretty comedian, Angela. We get these guys on, they kill the the solidity of our event, the sensitivity of our event just goes out of the window. I feel very bad about that. But no, jokes apart, a lot of respect, Angela. Thank you for what you've done, and kudos to you and Oxfam. See you. Bye, guys.
Okay, catch us on any of the podcasting apps, please. We beg you, we need you. Send us your questions on Twitter on Cyrus Says In, or you can email us, even if you're not female, on whatcyrussays@gmail.com.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Paisa Vaisa, we have a midweek special. Anupam is joined by Chintan Haria, Head of Product Development and Strategy at ICICI Prudential AMC. They talk about the ICICI Prudential NASDAQ 100 Index Fund. What's it like to be a woman in the city? Find out on the Filter Coffee, where Vedashi Kambete Sharma talks to Karthik about her new book, Fatal Mistakes. On Audio Gyan, Shreya Satish, founder and CEO of OwnPath, talks to Kedar and Abhineet about how OwnPath was created to help professionals grow in their career through lifelong learning and professional networks. On The Longest Constitution, Priya explains how bar dancers are barred from dancing due to an arbitrary moral distinction in the name of public morality. And on Agla Station Adulthood, Ritasha and Ayushi discuss the hazards of chaos and the importance of appreciating silence. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our others for that matter, please do tell a friend. We really appreciate you spreading this. Word of mouth helps a lot. And finally, this week, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Cred, Bank of Baroda, Quarter, CoinSwitch, Kuber, Slay Coffee, and Intel. We really appreciate the support.
From uncensored and unfiltered chats with the who's who of the entertainment industry, I, Siddharth Kannan, bring your very heartcake chat show called Candid Kannan. Tune in every Friday on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.